Going into our discussion, we're looking at the Nigeria macroeconomic outlook for 2025. There's indeed a report published by Very Africa, and of course, quite a whole lot of topics there that it did look at. It talked about the outlook for domestic economy, the world crude oil price, the outlook for inflation, renewable energy development, electricity supply industry analysis, non-oil sector outlook, and a whole lot of them there that we are going to be looking at them one by one today. My guest is right here, Dr. Adegboyega Adebajo is an economist and of course investment banking professional. Glad to have you on Business Daily.
Thank you very much.
Yes, interesting report there. I went through that report yesterday.
Yeah.
And the outlook are not in any way so interesting based on some of the statistics that we saw there.
Yeah, well, I dare say it's been an interesting year so far in 2025, and you know that prayer of sorts, may we live in interesting times. I think next year is going to be as interesting. Just this morning I was reading a news item that said we will perhaps start to see the effect of all the reforms next year, and I do hope it's positive what we tend to see. But back to the report by Verve Africa, I must commend the authors of that report. It's I was wondering to myself if anyone's sitting down and going to actually take a look at what has happened in 2024, put all those statistics together. I haven't had the time to do that myself, but it's exciting to see that in a document. And they haven't just stopped there, they've also gone on beyond that to project, to give us an outlook what 2025 is like. Yes. And I think the usual suspects have come up. We've got inflation, we've got exchange rates, we've got the population figures and the impact of oil and gas exports on the economy. These are the usual suspects. But there's some other interesting things which, for me, from a strategic perspective, should be an indication to government of something to work on. And I'd like to draw attention, first of all, to the fact that the services sector has grown so significantly in terms of its contribution to GDP. It has outstripped agriculture. And industry has fallen behind so much more than it used to be. Now, if all we're doing is services, then we would have that aspect where in the outlook, the matter of over-reliance of imports coming. Because we're providing services, but we're actually not producing the things we need in the economy. And for as long as we continue to import, the impact of the exchange rates will be felt in prices. And when that happens, we will continue to see inflation. Of course, the outlook says perhaps the peak inflation we might see next year is about 37. That will be welcome, considering the fact that we got as high as 40% this year. But then it's not good news to anyone that prices will continue to rise. If that happens, the tightening that a lot of families, a lot of homes, a lot of individuals have felt will be even more so felt. And of course, I think it's time, perhaps, when we start seeing what the government's plans are, we may start to consider whether they have looked at all these indices and there are plans to ensure that they are properly managed.
Indeed. Well, you made mention about government planning. You also talk about the reforms as well, whether by next year we'll begin to see the positive effect of these reforms. There's a report from IMF. I don't know if you have seen that report. They did say that the government should begin to rethink their strategies in carrying out these reforms. Apparently, the reform may not be working, maybe according to IMF expectation.
Well, remember, Yusuf, we were here and we spoke about the NPR continuing to be raised, and we did wonder what the CBN wanted to achieve. The logic was perfect. But then we have not seen the increase in NPR rates reduce inflation or stop inflation. We're still over the 30% mark, every month in, month out. And I think that's quite an indication. Even the IMF probably feels that if inflation continues at the rate in which it's going, the overdependence on imports, exchange rate volatility, perhaps we don't know where it's going to end up. And I think that's a key aspect of strategy, a key aspect of planning. When you set up a plan, there are targeted outcomes, and you need to start reviewing as you progress whether those outcomes will be achieved
Absolutely.
or not. Indications are, and that has left a few people confused as to what exactly are the outcomes of these objectives. And I think that's a big question.
Indeed, since you made mention about inflation, let's look at the inflation number as it were in 1999 when we usher in this democracy. We have it in our part one there, if my director can indeed put it on the screen there. Of course, in 2023 as at now, what we had was 24.66%. If we can get the part one of it, the part one did show how much inflation were in 1999, which was around 6%. If you look at the growth trajectory from that 6% to what we had, of course, look at 1999, there 6.62% when we usher in this democracy. If you look at the trajectory, it's been upward. It got to 18%, it came down to 12%, 14%, 15%, 17%, and of course, since then, it has been on the increase. As of today, is 33.88%, which some people are even saying that NBS is being economical with the truth. That if you go to the market and see the reality of things, that the inflation numbers is way beyond that.
Well, I'm not going to question the NBS, and I say that not because those who say they're not telling the truth may not have a basis for that. I mean, one thing we can all generally agree is that prices are rising, and you can sometimes check just a month apart. Prices will be different on most items, but that takes us back again to what exactly we're counting when we talk about inflation. Inflation, remember, is the rate at which prices rise. Whether they're rising fast, you have high inflation. They're rising slowly, you have low inflation. The thing is, over time, prices will rise, but management of inflation expects that we will reduce that rate, and that's where we anticipate very low inflation. So we should ask ourselves, what exactly are the drivers of inflation right now, and what's going on? Two things have come up in this regard. Firstly, fuel prices, and as we know, when you look at headline inflation, you have that much of that impact. And with the increase in fuel prices, you also have the floating of the naira, and the implied depreciation of the naira that happened at that time. And a thought occurred to me last night, Yusuf, that if fuel subsidies had remained the way they were, but the exchange rate was floated and the naira had depreciated, the pump price would have had to go up anyway, because at that time we were importing practically all the fuel, petrol we were using in the country. So we would have had an increase in fuel prices. Now, even with the exchange rates held constant, if the subsidy had been removed and the fuel price had gone up that way, we would have ended up with inflation too. Now, to have these two elements working on inflation simultaneously, that is the situation we found ourselves in. And I will not blame government per se or throw it at their feet where this is concerned. Those are steps that had been argued, and a lot of us felt it was necessary to do. But in terms of the impact, I guess with reality, the measurement of the social impact of such steps can hardly be imagined unless they're felt. Again, that is why we probably have the IMF rethinking, seeing what's going on in the country, hearing the news, reading the news, and probably saying, hey, shouldn't we start to assess this? We need exchange rate that would change a lot of things. Right now, there are all kinds of speculation, and for as long as we have speculation, we have volatility. Foreign investment will not come in, because when they want to repatriate their proceeds, they're not sure if they're going to need more naira to get the same dollars.
Absolutely.
You also have a lot of Nigerians who feel, oh, the naira is going to keep falling, so each time I get enough naira, I buy dollars and I hold my savings in dollars. Again, that puts pressure on the naira, and it gets worse. And that's all because of volatility. The years you mentioned where we had much lower inflation, there was stability in the exchange rate, and it works both ways. Again, the CBN has been raising the NPR, yes, but we still have a situation, and I do not have statistical evidence to this, but there's been speculation that at the end of every month, when states get allocated back, because of certain projects, a certain percentage is converted. Yes, again, that demand impacts. Now, remember, we said the services sector is high, and services deals with intangible goods. Now, if the producers, the industries are not producing enough, it's left to the services, and services tends to be consumer based. So I for instance, I'm a consultant. I don't produce anything tangible, so my earnings tend to go either into investment or into consumption. And so if you've got services sector that high, and all they're doing is consuming, and what they're consuming tends to be imported, then you're going to have that demand on the importation, and that's pressure on the exchange rate again.
Indeed, quite a whole lot of analysis there. You made mention about converting naira to dollars because of some projects, and I was going to ask, is it really a very good practice that we pay contractors in dollars? Well, if you're a Nigerian contractor and you have to work for an American or a European company, are they going to pay you in naira?
Well, let's step back a bit, and we can't assume that that's always the case for all the projects. Now,
projects
where they're heavy infrastructure projects and they require certain equipment to be brought in, you will find that there is a component in dollars, not necessarily the entire amount in dollars, but a component. And I think it's fair to say every single infrastructure project has a dollar component, essentially because of the elements that need to be imported. So it's a percentage thing. No one's going to just pay you for local expenses in US dollars. So it's not that arbitrary. There's a strictness about that. So I think that's fair.
All right. Yeah. Let's look at inflation analysis here. The analysis here is based on three case scenarios. We talk about base case scenario, talk about best case scenario, and of course worst case scenario. Can you make us understand what this portrays?
Well, again, like I said, inflation is about the rate at which prices rise. And we've got to think about what are the things that may happen in 2025 to really make prices rise high. First of all, I believe the war in Ukraine is going to stop. And when that stops and eases off, Russia may be more willing to sell more of its gas to Europe. That should bring down some tension. However, I'm not quite sure yet what the administration is going to do in the Middle East. That has a tendency to also push up oil prices more than the war in Europe. Now, all those would impact us in the sense that we rely so much for export proceeds from oil and gas sector than anything else. If our reserves and the trade balances are in our favor, they continue to work and our reserves rise, we may see an appreciation or at least a stability of the naira. I would love to hear at the beginning of this year with the budget a target exchange rate. Yes, it's fine to float it, but we know that there are fundamentals working on floating. So you would ideally have a target rate. Having a target rate enables people to plan and to project. And whatever the target rate is, it means the CBN, through its monetary policy, the government through its fiscal policy, will try to ensure that we attain that rate for planning purposes, not just for government, but also for the private sector. If the exchange rate is stable, we may have a best case scenario. So the rise in prices, and that's where you have the rise in prices, may not be so volatile, may not be impactful. But that's only one aspect, the exchange rate. The climate, the rains were pretty heavy this year. Sometimes when you've got rain so heavy in one particular year, the next year it's not so heavy. But we don't know what really to expect next year. Because in some parts of the world, this was a year with the heaviest rainfall that had been seen in quite a while. But I would hope that we start to prepare. So if there's any flooding next year, we are not caught out in terms of on the agricultural part, and absolutely. Food remains available, because food security is key.
It's key indeed there. And let's quickly look at the world crude oil price for next year. You did make mention about the war in Ukraine. There probably as long as that war continue, there may still be volatility in the international crude oil market. As of today, it's around $71 a barrel, which is way below Nigeria budget expectation for 2025. Of course, you know, Nigeria relies so much on crude oil for their revenue. So what do you think will happen in next year with regards to crude oil prices? Of course, don't forget, Trump is an enemy of high oil prices.
Yeah, well, but he's also a businessman, and he favors the rich. So if for any reason I'd say we shouldn't be too optimistic about prices. The war in Europe will typically affect more of gas prices than the oil price itself. But what's happening in the Middle East will have more of a direct impact on oil, because the Saudis are more interested in peace now. Trump, of course, is going to look for a solution where Israel will not feel so threatened. Quite happily, the Iranians, and they have a lot of oil, have
Saudi Arabia.
Yes, the Iranians have been very moderate in their response to the Israeli attack. And we can see, and I hope that means that nobody really wants a conflagration of the crisis. So I think we will have a fairly stable oil market next year. What that means is that Nigeria needs to take the opportunity to also ramp up its production and to reduce losses in the sector of crude oil exploration.
Indeed, of course, Nigeria relies so much, like I said, on crude oil for its revenue. Looking at the external sector projection, talking about our foreign reserves, as at now, as we speak, is way below, above $38 billion, below $40 billion, as the case may be. Do you see us, making more dollars next year to shore up our foreign reserves?
I'm not too sure we have a plan to shore up our reserves. I see a lot more, and I hear a lot more about spending plans. Yes, we need to spend. There are lots of infrastructure projects to do in the power sector. We keep hearing of the failing of the national grid. There's a need to spend money to make sure that stops to happen. Defense continues to take a sizable portion of the budget, and the terrorism is not exactly going away like we thought it would. And let me just quickly say this about the defense budget. In economics, money spent on war is a sunk cost. It's not productive. You put all that money, you produce one bullet, or if you're not producing, you import a bullet, and once that bullet is shot, it's expired, that money has gone. So money spent on war is not productive at all, and that takes a chunk of our national budget each year because of terrorism. That's money that could have gone into the power sector, money that could have gone into building dams to manage the flood, money that could have gone into roads, and that takes me to another aspect of it all. So we're having to borrow to be able to carry out all these infrastructure projects. And those infrastructure projects are necessary. I think what I would like to see over the next 18 months is the government pointing to these infrastructure projects it has been talking about, and we can see them completed. So there's actually something to show for all the money that's been spent on them. And I think that's very important. Then that's productive.
Indeed, we hope to see the impact that it's going to have on the larger population. Let's talk about energy, which is very important. Talking about power, talk about the national grid, which has been collapsing now. I think for more than 10 times this year, we've experienced that. Let's look at renewable energy. Don't you think it's a sector that we need to deliberately tap into? I mean, I use that word because there seems not to be so much a pressure from the government, because we have a lot of, if you go to northern Nigeria, for example, the sunlight light in that place, the wind are strong enough to, generate electricity.
Yeah, you're right, Yusuf. And I wonder why it's taking so long to think about it this way. Because there are lots of private individuals working on much smaller types of power generation using renewable energy. And I believe the steps are starting to sink in. Something happened in Lagos State a while back, and that was Lagos State generating its own electricity to power all the government offices. I read somewhere about this happening in Edo State. I think it's important that in the north, a lot of the state governments start to think about how to generate power off the national grid.
Yes. Kano is taking along the line already.
Exactly, off the national grid for the benefit of their own offices and their own powering their own infrastructure, hospitals, major schools, government offices, so they can be productive in terms of their administration. The potential is there significantly. I think the thought is starting to go. And remember, like you and I have discussed, the governors need to get up off their seats, move around their states, and start being creative in terms of what they need to do for the benefit of their states.
Indeed, of course, a lot of them are not taking advantage of the new Electricity Act already passed by the National Assembly.
Yes, in terms of setting up their own electricity boards and starting to generate their electricity, even charging some GRAs for electricity, take them off the grid, provide them. So the possibilities are there. And when I think of the states I've been to in the north, and there's always that GRA where you see those lovely houses and all, but they are on the national grid. Most of them have generators. Some have put in their private solar power arrangements, but it's still possible to network them onto a particular state's grid. And then we stop having to rely on the national grid. And with the national grid not being so much of a national grid anymore, power continues to be available in most places.
Indeed. Let's look at the non-oil sector now, talking about economic diversification now. The contribution of this sector to the GDP has not really been so encouraging, talking about agriculture, mining, manufacturing, and a whole lot of them. What sort of outlook should we expect next year? Looking at this report here, the likes of sesame seed contributing about just 11.04%, fertilizer 13.78%, cocoa 23.18%, and of course others 52%.
I start to wonder why we aren't dimensioning our agriculture in terms of what needs to be done. The statistics are there, and I don't want to rehash them about the size of the arable land, the percentage that's being farmed. And I'm not just looking at export potential. I'm one of those people who feel we shouldn't even be exporting primary produce. We should be processing primary produce with the value add before we export. Because when we export the primary produce, we end up importing the value add. So we've lost all what we could have gained from exporting in the first place. You mentioned those commodities, but there's a lot more than that. Are farmers getting the inputs that's necessary? Are farmers getting the support that's necessary? The North has a lot more land available for farming, and land issues in the North are not as critical as down South. You can easily get 200 hectares somewhere in the North of farm like that, but it's very difficult to find 200 hectares down South. And when you look at
a particular location,
yes, and when you look at states like River States, Cross River, Bayelsa, then you know it's much more difficult to get farmland as such. But every part of Nigeria has its own uniqueness and its own capacity to contribute something very interesting to agriculture. And when I say agriculture, that includes aquaculture, because I mentioned some states earlier. So there needs to be a plan, a specific plan, where we look at these aspects. There's a sugar policy I'm aware of. There's not much that's happening because you can't sit down and want to take agriculture as an entire whole. You've got to break it down into the component parts, not just by commodity, also in terms of land, in terms of land being prepared for farming, in terms of inputs, in terms of support during the farming period, and in terms of harvest and access to markets. Those areas need to be seen. The distribution, the logistics, there's no concern there. Someone had once proposed that there should be what's called the green routes, where we know that agric produce passes from the farm to the market, and that's very, very key. So these are things we need to look at deliberately, things that would help food security.
Absolutely. Yeah. Moving on, as we begin to round up, let's look at labor market and employment projection for 2025. The report did say that the unemployment rate is projected to be reported as relatively low, but the current economic difficulties is expected to continue through 2025. This is a very many Nigerians will not want to hear this.
Well, I can tell you that there was a lot of noise when the National Bureau of Statistics came out with that low unemployment figure. But then again, like I said, that is their figure, and they put their reasoning behind it. There was an explanation, but not everybody accepted the explanation. And so what you have in their case is that there is a lot of informal employment, and then the unemployment rates amongst the young ones, 15 to 24, and amongst the recent graduates is significantly high, and we've got 70% of our population being young people. So I think it's dangerous to have so many young people unemployed. Quite dangerous. So we've had the Japa syndrome, and what you find happening in the world is the shift to nationalism. We've seen that in the States with Trump. We slightly missed that happening in France and in Italy. But with Trump's, victory, some people in Europe will be emboldened. If that happens, the doors for migration are going to be closed.
But in any case, Trump had just 4 years.
Well, yeah, but you see, 4 years may be something, but the impacts will then be felt. And that's why I talk about Europe too, because it's a wave. And if it becomes a wave, then it wouldn't be just about one person. It will be about the thought behind it, the paradigm that these immigrants are taking over our countries. And when you think about it, it's almost the same thing happening from an ethnic perspective, even within national borders.
Absolutely.
All over the world. So we need to be mindful about how to engage our young ones. I, for one, think that in universities, beyond the disciplines the young ones are being taught, there needs to be elements of entrepreneurship. So people come out of university thinking in terms of what they can do, what problems they can solve, and how they can commercialize those solutions, and how they can come together and work together as a team. So you have 4, 5, maybe 10 of them clustering to form a company to solve a problem.
All right. Finally, now let's look at the internal economic imbalances. You made mention about the Jackpot syndrome, and of course the wave of migration especially from Africa to Europe, as the case may be. Don't you think the economic imbalance that we have in Nigeria, and of course by extension the African continent, is responsible for the mass exodus, especially the young people from the continent?
Well, again, like I was just talking about and saying there need to be more of entrepreneurs. You need to have young minds and young brains actively engaged. Otherwise, there will be disillusionment, there will be desperation, and because they have to survive. Within Nigeria, and that for me speaks a lot to the internal imbalances, you have a lot of migration from the rural areas to the urban areas. Just travel anywhere. Once it's rural, you're not going to find the young enterprising minds there because they need the engagement that more urban areas tend to produce. And that's going to be a problem if we don't, again, like I said, having such a large percentage of young people not actively engaged, looking for what to do, is going to become problematic.
And indeed, government, we hope that government, not only in Nigeria, in Africa, will do something to stem that time, because some people have said it's a time bomb waiting to explode. I must thank you for your time, Dr. Adegboyega Adebajo, economist, investment banking professional, for your time on Business Daily. We appreciate your contribution.
Thank you so much.
All right. With that is a wrap on the show today. We'll be back again tomorrow. I am Yusuf Akubu.